The last two types of transformations we're going to look at are reflections and the absolute value transformation. In this particular example, we're going to be using the exponential function f of x equals 2 to the x. You can see here some points, and I added one extra point in the chart. When x is 1, y is 2. Well, let's start it. When x is negative 2, 2 to the negative 2 is 1/4. 2 to the negative 1 is 1/2. 2 to the 0 is 1. 2 to the first is 2. 2 squared is 4. So these are the points that I have listed here on here. Notice that as x gets into larger and larger negative values, the fractions are getting smaller and smaller. And so what happens as we make x more and more negative, f of x gets smaller and smaller, but it never actually equals 0. So we have an asymptote on the x-axis. So the graph approaches the x-axis but never touches it. So this is what the f of x equals 2 to the x graph looks like. Well, if we put a negative sign outside the function, that means we are taking the opposite of the entire function. So negative 2 to the x. So whatever 2 to the x was before, we're going to take the opposite of that. So 2 to the x is the y value. This affects y. So all the y values are going to become the opposite of what they were before. Now in this particular graph, all of our y values are positive, so they're all going to become negative. If any of them were negatives to start with, they would become positive. They're just all going to become opposite of what they are. So we're going to write down here all y values switch signs from positive to negative or from negative to positive. So for example, 2 positive 4 becomes 2 negative 4. 1 positive 2 becomes 1 negative 2. 0, 1 becomes 0, negative 1, and so forth. And we have one more here. Negative 1.5 becomes negative 1, negative 0.5, and the graph now looks like this. So this is a vertical reflection. So when I'm talking about vertical, it's flipping this direction. A vertical reflection across the x-axis. Now what if the function wasn't all positive y values to start with? So let's just look down here. If we had this function below and I did negative f of x here, it would end up looking like this. This part would flip down here, this part would flip up here. So that's what it would look like if we had both positive and negative y values to start with. Now, the next one is f of negative x. This is inside the function. So this is going to affect the graph in the x direction. What this graph looks like is 2 to the negative x. So we take our input value, which is x, and make it negative. So how is this going to affect the graph? Well, if I put in negative 2 for x and I do 2 to the negative x, well, negative 2 becomes positive 2 when I take the opposite of it. So then I have 2 squared, which is 4. When I put in negative 1, it becomes 2 to the positive 1, which is 2. 2 to the 0 is still 2 to the 0, which is 1. 2 to the first now is 2 to the negative 1, which is 1/2. And 2 to the second, if x is 2, it becomes 2 to the negative 2, which is 1/4. So notice now, instead of negative 2 going with 1/4, negative 2 goes with 4. And instead of positive 2 going with 4, positive 2 goes with 1/4. So all of the x values are switching which y value they go with. So 2, 4, instead of 2, 4, I have negative 2, 4. So notice it's my x's that are switching. So here it was my y's, 4, positive 4 changed to negative 4. Here's positive 2 changed to negative 2. I'm changing my x values. 1, 2 is now negative 1, 2. 0, 1 stays the same, and then my point negative 1.5 becomes positive 1.5, and the graph looks like this. So notice what happens is the graph is flipping across the y-axis. So this is a horizontal reflection across the y-axis. And in this case, all x values change signs instead of the y values. So those are the reflections. Now, looking at the last one, the absolute value, what happens if I take the absolute value of the entire function? So in this case, this would be the absolute value of the cube root of x. Well, I put in x, I find the cube root, and sometimes I get positive values for y, like 1 and 2 here, and sometimes I get negative values for y, like negative 1 and negative 2. So what happens is any of the y values that are negative become positive because I'm taking the absolute value, but anything that's already positive doesn't change. So all negative y values become positive. Positive y values don't change. So this becomes, when x is negative 8, instead of y being negative 2, it becomes positive 2. When x is negative 1, instead of y being negative 1, it becomes positive 1. The other three stay the same. So 8 negative 2 becomes 8 positive 2. Negative 1 becomes negative 1 positive 1. So nothing down here is on the graph anymore. The graph is all of the positive side, anything above the x-axis, and then anything below the x-axis flips up. So this is what the graph looks like, is this kind of like a bird. So the positive side, anything above the x-axis doesn't change. Anything below the x-axis reflects up. Okay, so that's what the absolute value does. So if I took the absolute value of this graph right here, nothing would change because it's already all above the x-axis. But anything that has negative y values, those will change to positive.